Building highly available application architectures in Azure is made very simple when you're utilizing things like the Azure Load Balancer. So it's really easy to set up, it's very straightforward, and it's a great way to add high availability into one or more tiers of your application. So one of the main resources we're going to focus on throughout this module is the Azure Load Balancer, and this is a piece of infrastructure that you can use to load balance resources in a single Azure region. So you can use load balancing across availability zones, but you're going to be working in a single region with this particular resource. So as you can see here from the screenshot of the service homepage for the load balancer, we can instantly add scale to our applications. We can load balance both internet and private network traffic. Later on, I'll show you an architectural diagram of that. But what they're saying here is you can build an Azure load balancer for the front end of your application, and you can also have load balancers internally within your application architectures that can load balance things like API tiers, database tiers, and we'll see an example of that later on. But this piece of infrastructure has integrated health checks, and it's really easy to set up load balancing rules. And it's a very interesting piece of infrastructure. Later on, I'm going to take you into the portal. I'm going to show you around and how you configure this thing, but it's super easy to work with. Now, there are two different kind of tiers here. Notice where it says start free. So there is a basic tier for this piece of infrastructure. Then there's the standard tier. That's the one you'll want to use when you're load balancing across multiple availability zones. And we'll see that here in a little bit. And the other thing to keep in mind about this load balancer infrastructure is it can load balance both TCP and UDP based protocols. Now, in addition to the Azure load balancer, there's the concept of the application gateway. And from a configuration perspective, there's a lot of similarities between the application gateway and the Azure load balancer. And as you can see here from the service homepage screenshot, this is an HTTP based load balancing solution. So this is strictly for web applications. And so this would be a great solution when you need more of an application-aware or more intelligent type of load balancer. So you can do things like cookie-based affinity, so you can have more control over the session state, keep users with the same backend server that they've started with. You've got management capabilities through Azure APIs. You've got web application firewall rules or WAF rules that you can integrate with this thing and do some perimeter security before traffic ever reaches your servers. And you can also do SSL offloading. So you can upload an SSL certificate and basically not have a certificate on the back-end servers. So it's a very great way for you to build a scalable and highly secure application environment for a set of web servers. But in terms of putting servers behind this piece of infrastructure and configuring load balancing rules, it's very similar in concept to working with the Azure Load Balancer. So I'll show you the Azure Load Balancer, and then once you see that, the application gateway will make a lot of sense when you go to configure that resource. So keep in mind between the Azure Load Balancer and the application gateway, these are two load balancing solutions that you can use in a single Azure region. And you can load balance resources across availability zones. But the next question is, what about multiple regions? So we do have this concept of the Azure Traffic Manager, and this is a DNS load balancing solution. So we can't stretch a load balancer across two different physical regions, but we can do DNS load balancing. So the Traffic Manager is a perfect solution for this. So we've got different routing policies that the Traffic Manager supports, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get further in this module. But this is a great solution for disaster recovery or even just doing highly available designs that are spread across multiple regions in the Azure platform. And so to draw this out a little bit for you so you can kind of visualize what this all is going to look like, let's focus on maybe an Azure load balancer. This would be the same architecture if we were going to use an application gateway for a single region, highly available design. So let's say that our users come to a website, globalmantics.com. We've got a DNS record for that points to a public Azure load balancer. So we've built an Azure load balancer or an application gateway that's internet facing. And then notice that on the back end, on the inside network, we've got web servers in availability zone 1 and availability zone 2. So as long as we've deployed an Azure standard load balancer or an Azure application gateway, we can load balance across these two separate availability zones. And then those servers can go off and talk to a SQL server somewhere. And this might be a managed SQL server database like we saw in the last module, where we can have multiple copies of that database and have highly available implementation for Azure SQL as well. Another thing you can do here is build another set of servers in both availability zones, your own SQL servers, and set up database availability groups or set up SQL mirroring depending on the actual database engine you're working with. So this is a really basic design, but I'm going to show you some more complex ones later. I want to give you a very clear picture of how load balancers work in Azure. And with that, let's move to the next video. We'll build our first Azure virtual network, and I'll point out a couple of things that you'll want to think about as you're designing your highly available solutions.